Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the January of 1884, and the coldest winter anyone in that town would live to brag about. Della Mercer kept a dry goods store that was dying under her, and she spent that whole long winter watching the silent blacksmith across the muddy street and believing every single morning that she was the only one doing any watching at all. She was wrong about that from the first cold day, and the proof of how wrong was already being struck into iron 40 strikes deep before she ever thought to look. But she did not know that yet. All she knew that January was the cold, the ledger, and the man with the soot on his hands who would not lift his eyes to her window. The store had been her husband's. Samuel Mercer died in the autumn of a fever that took him in 9 days, and he left Della a counter, a stockroom going thin, and a debt to the freight company in Cheyenne that came due in the spring. She was 26 years old, and the town of Bitter Creek had already decided what would become of her. She heard it the way you hear a draft under a door, a cold, steady fact you cannot see. A widow could not run a store. A widow would sell by April, or she would marry by April, and either way the counter would belong to a man by the time the creek thawed. She kept a tally because the tally was the only honest thing she had. Each night she set the lamp on the counter and counted the coins in the till and wrote the number in the back of Samuel's ledger, and each night the number was smaller than she wanted it to be. She owed the freight company $200. On the 1st of January, she had 91. She did not let herself think the word that sat under that arithmetic. She just wrote the number and closed the book. The forge stood directly across the street. Tom Brask had run it for 6 years, and in 6 years Della had heard him speak perhaps 40 words. The town called him slow. They said it kindly, and they said it cruel, depending on who was saying it. But they all said it, because a man who did not court and did not drink and did not talk was a man they could not place. And a town will name a thing it cannot place. Tom was broad through the shoulders the way a door is broad. His hands were burned brown, and his forearms were scarred white, where the sparks had landed over the years, and he moved through the cold without seeming to feel it in his shirt sleeves, while other men ran from doorway to doorway with their collars up. Della watched him the way you watch weather. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself a woman alone learns to watch the street out of plain caution. And that was half true, and she knew it was only half. She watched him shoe the Hartley orphan's mule in December and refuse the 2 bits the older boy held out, folding the boy's fingers back over the coin with his great burned hand, gentle as folding a letter. She watched him time his coal runs. The coal man came down the street twice a week, and twice a week Tom found a reason to be hauling a barrow past her storefront just as the wagon passed, and he never once looked up at her glass. She decided he did not know she existed. She decided she was a widow, mooning at a window over a man who would never lift his eyes, and she half despised herself for the warmth it put in her chest on a morning when nothing else was warm. One bitter Thursday, the coal wagon got stuck axle deep in the frozen ruts in front of her door, and the coal man cursed and whipped his team and got nowhere. Della watched Tom set down his barrow, set his shoulder to the box, and lift. The wheel came up out of the rut like a tooth pulled clean. "Obliged, Brask," the coal man said, and Tom only nodded. But on his way past her step, he stooped and picked up a length of stove wood that had rolled off her woodpile into the slush. and he set it back on the stack, squared where it belonged. He did not look at the window above it. Della stood with her hand on the cold counter and felt that small squared thing in her chest the rest of the day. She did not know he counted her lamp. She did not know that every night Tom Brask banked his fire and stood a moment at the wide black mouth of his door and waited to see her lamp go dark across the street before he climbed to his cold loft so that he would know she was safe inside before he slept. She did not know any of that. The whole shape of it was hidden from her. The way the deepest thing is always hidden struck into a place she had no reason yet to look. The saloon men noticed Tom too, but they noticed him the way boys notice a slow dog. There was a man called Cobb Ferris who ran cards at the Antler and who had decided that winter that the blacksmith was a thing worth being cruel to. Della saw it through her glass on a Tuesday. 3 of them had Tom near the watering trough, and Cobb was holding the brim of Tom's hat and pulling it down over the big man's eyes and laughing while Tom stood and took it. "Say something, Brask," Cobb was saying. "Go on, one whole word. We'll buy you a drink for one whole word." Tom said nothing. He took his hat back when they let him, and he settled it, and he walked to his forge, and the men laughed because not fighting looked to them exactly like not being able to fight. Della stood at her counter with her hand pressed flat to the cold glass, and she was surprised to find she was furious in her hands and her throat on behalf of a man she had never properly spoken to. That afternoon she did the first brave thing of her widowed life. She put on Samuel's heavy coat, and she crossed the muddy street, and she stepped into the heat of the forge, and the heat hit her like a hand. Tom looked up. His eyes were gray and tired and not slow at all, and they went wide to see her standing in his doorway with the cold pouring in behind her. "Mr. Brask," she said, "my stovepipe's drawing wrong and smoking out my whole back room. I was told you mend such things." It was a lie. The pipe drew fine. She had invented it on the walk across. He did not answer in words. He nodded once, and he set down his hammer, and he banked his fire, and he took up a length of tin and a pair of snips, and he followed her back across the street, and he fixed a pipe that had nothing wrong with it, finding some small honest fault to mend so that the lie would not be a lie. When he was done, he stood in her smoky little back room, enormous in it, turning his hat in his hands. "It draws now," he said. 3 words. She counted them foolishly, the way she counted everything that winter. "What do I owe you?" she said. He looked at the floor, and then he looked at the lean shelves of her dying store, and something moved across his face that she could not read. "Nothing," he said, and he left. That was December. The thing she would not understand until the cold heart of January was that he had not been looking at her shelves with pity. He had been reading her ledger off her face the way she read his silence off his hands, and he had walked back across the street with her name already living in his chest. And he had done what a man like Tom Brask does with a thing he cannot say. He had gone to the only voice he owned. He had picked up a cold chisel, and on the flat of his anvil, where the metal was hardest and the word would last longest, he had begun to teach his hand to write the one thing his mouth would not. She did not know. So the winter went on, and the tally fell. A week after the pipe, she found a new chimney damper sitting on her back step, plain and well-made, no note. She asked the Hartley boy if he had seen who left it, and the boy shrugged and said only that he had seen the smith out early, hammering tin by lamplight. She set the damper in the pipe. It fit as if it had been measured to her stove, because it had been. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself a great many things were nothing that winter. If a story like this is the kind that keeps you company on a cold night, take a moment to subscribe before the snow falls in this one, because the part that turns it is close now, and it turns on a single word struck 40 times. January came down hard. The creek that ran behind the smithy froze, and then, in a false thaw the third week, broke and flooded, and a calf of the Hartley boys went into the black water at the ford. Della heard the shouting from her counter. She got to her door in time to see Tom Brask go into Bitter Creek up to his chest in the killing cold, his shirt going dark, his arms full of a struggling calf, and she watched him heave the animal up onto the bank to the boys, and then turn to climb out himself and feel his own legs not answer him. The cold had him. He went down once. The older Hartley boy caught his collar, and 2 men ran from the livery, and they hauled Tom Brask out of the creek the way you haul a felled tree, and he was gray and shaking, and his lips had gone the color of the water. They carried him to his loft over the forge, and they stripped the wet off him and piled him with blankets, and the doctor came and said the cold had got deep into him, and that he would live if his lungs stayed clear, and that someone had best keep the forge fire alive day and night, because a forge gone cold in this weather would crack its own fire brick, and the chimney would freeze and split, and a man laid up with no working forge in January had nothing to come back to in the spring. "Who tends it?" the doctor said, looking around the loft at the men who had carried him. The men looked at their boots. They had wives and stock and their own fires to keep. Tom Brask had no one. That was the plain fact of him that the whole town had agreed not to look at directly. "I'll do it," Della said, from the doorway, where she had come up the loft stairs without anyone marking her. "I'm across the street. I'll bank his fire." So that was how Della Mercer came to be alone in the silent man's forge at 4 o'clock in the freezing dark, every morning and every night for 9 days, feeding coal into the heart of a fire that was not hers to keep a man alive she had spoken perhaps a dozen sentences to. She learned the fire. She learned how much coal it ate, and how the bellows woke it, and how the heat lived in the brick after. She did it the way she did everything, carefully, by the numbers, counting the scoops of coal so the supply would last until he could rise. On the 3rd night she went looking for more coal, and found tucked behind the slack tub in a flour sack, gone stiff with cold, a heavy roll of saved coins. She did not count it, though she wanted to. She knew the weight of money in her hand by then, and this was more than $200, a quiet fortune set by a man who lived in a cold loft and refused a boy's 2 bits. She set the sack back exactly as she had found it, and said nothing, the way he had said nothing about her shelves. On the 7th night, climbing down with the lamp, she heard him stir, and she went up. He was awake, his eyes following her in the dark, and his cracked lips moved. "The fire," he said. 2 words, all he could spend. "It's banked," she said. "It'll hold till morning. Lie still." He looked at her a long moment, and then his eyes went down to the forge, to the anvil sitting black in the firelight, and a kind of panic crossed his face, and he tried to sit up. "Don't," he said, and the word broke into coughing, and she pressed him back with a hand flat on his great chest, and did not understand why a sick man should fear his own anvil. She did not look where he was looking. not yet. And on the 9th morning, the fire well banked and the gray light just comin', she set her scoop down and she put her cold hand flat on the anvil to lean her weight a moment and rest. And she felt under her palm a roughness in the iron, and she looked down. There, on the flat of the anvil, struck into the hard face of it with a cold chisel, was her name, Della, and below it, her name again, and below that, again. The first one was crooked, the D leaning, the letters fighting each other. The next was straighter, the next straighter still. Down the face of the anvil, her own name marched. The same 5 letters cut into iron over and over, each one a little cleaner than the last. Each one the hand getting surer, a man teaching his fist the shape of the only word he had ever needed to say and could not. She stood in the cold and the gray light, and she put her finger to the first crooked one, and she began, without deciding to count. She counted to 40. 40 times Tom Brask had picked up the chisel in the firelight after she had gone home, and her lamp had gone dark across the street, and 40 times he had struck her name into the one material he could shape, because it was the one place he could put the thing that lived in him and the only voice he trusted not to fail him. The noticing had not run one direction. It had never run one direction. While she stood at her glass, believing herself the only watcher in Bitter Creek, the silent man across the street had been riding her into iron 40 times over in a hand that got steadier every night with the wanting. She did not weep. She found she could not, the way you cannot, when a thing is too large to leak out small. She stood with her hand on the cold last letter, and she understood that she had been wrong, completely and from the first morning wrong, about which of them was the watcher and which the watched. Then she heard the stairs. He had got up. He should not have. He came down into the forge in his stocking feet, with a blanket round his great shoulders, gray face still, holding the rail, and he saw her standing at his anvil with her hand on his secret, and the look that came over Tom Brask's face was the most naked thing Della had ever seen on a grown man. He stopped on the bottom stair. He could not run, and he could not speak, and he could not take the iron back, and so he just stood there and let her see all of him, found out, the word out of his hands now and into the open air at last. "Don't," he said, one word ruined. "Don't read it. I'll grind it off. His voice broke on the cold in his chest. "It wasn't meant for seeing." "How long?" she said. He looked at the floor. "Since December," he said. "Since the pipe." He swallowed. "I can't, Della. I can't say things. They come out of other men easy, and they don't come out of me. I never could. They had a word from me about it in school, and it's the word they've still got. So He lifted one burned hand toward the anvil and let it drop. "I wrote it where it'd hold, so I'd have said it somewhere, even if it was only to the iron, even if you never—" He stopped. "The damper," she said, "on my step. That was you." He nodded once, the way he nodded at everything. "And the coin's behind the tub," she said quieter. $200 and more, and you let them call you slow." His jaw worked. "Saved it," he said, "years, for a thing I didn't think I'd get to have." He could not finish it. He did not have to. 40 times, she said. "I lost count after a while," he said, which she knew, looking at him, was the first lie he had ever told her, and she loved him for the smallness of it. She did not answer him with words either. She had run a store and buried a husband and watched a town decide her future for her, And she had learned that winter that the people who say the most are not always the ones who mean it, and she was done, entirely done, with being talked at. She crossed to the bench, and she took up the cold chisel that was still lying where he had left it, and she took up the small hammer, and she set the chisel to the iron in the empty space beneath the 40th striking of her name, and she looked at him so he would watch, and she began to strike. He came off the stair. "What are you, your hand? You'll—" "Stand still," she said. "I learned your fire. I can learn your iron." It took her a long time. It was clumsy, and the letters fought her, and the hammer rang and rang in the cold forge, and her arm ached, and Tom Brask stood wrapped in his blanket with the firelight on his ruined face, and watched the widow from across the street cut a word into his anvil beneath her own name 40 times over. When she was done, she stepped back, breathing hard, and she set the tools down, and he came and bent over the iron to read what she had answered, and the word she had struck under the long column of her name in letters as crooked and honest as his first one had been, was this: yours. He put his burned hand flat over the word, over both their words, her name 40 times, and her answer once, and he bowed his head, and his shoulders shook, and the silent man of Bitter Creek made no sound at all even then, because that was simply how he was made. But Della saw the tears fall off the end of his nose and hit the cold iron and steam there for half a second before they froze. She put her hand over his hand, over the word, across the street, unwatched for once. Her lamp burned alone in her empty store, and neither of them rose to tend it. They were married in the spring by the circuit preacher on the same day the creek thawed and ran clear behind the smithy. The town came, because a town that will not look at a lonely man directly will turn out gladly for a wedding, and Cobb Ferris stood at the back with his hat in his hands and did not say one cruel word, because cruelty needs a victim, and there was none left to be had. The freight company in Cheyenne was paid, in the end, not by the marriage and not by charity, but because a blacksmith who shoes the whole county is a man with $200 when he needs it, and Tom Brask had been quietly setting his coins by for years against a future he never thought he'd be allowed to have. Della kept the store. She kept it for 40 more years. She never sold it, and she never married it off to a man. And the town that had been so certain a widow could not run a counter bought their flour and their nails and their lamp oil from that widow until her hair went white. The anvil stayed in the forge. It outlived Tom, who went in the winter of 1921, an old man who had learned, slowly across the back half of his life, to say a handful of the things he had once only been able to strike into iron. After he was gone, Della would go out to the cold forge sometimes and stand at the anvil and put her old hand on the worn face of it, where her name still marched down the iron 40 times into the single word she had answered with. The letters, smoothed now by 40 years of work, struck over them, but never, ever struck out. She had thought that first January that she was the only one watching. She had stood at her glass every cold morning so sure that the noticing ran the one way, from her lonely side of the street to his, and that she would carry the watching alone to the end of her days, unanswered. She had been wrong from the first cold morning. He had been watching back the whole time. He had simply done his watching in the one place a man who cannot speak can make a thing permanent. And she had not known to look until the fire she was keeping for him gave him up. So here is the thing that story leaves in your hands. We spend so much of our lives certain that the caring runs only one direction, certain that the noticing we do is unanswered, that we are the only one at the window. And sometimes the answer has been there the whole time, struck into a place we never thought to look, in a language we never thought to read. If this story stayed with you tonight, sit with it a moment before you go. And tell me this, because I would truly like to know, have you ever been completely certain you were the only one watching, the only one who cared, and then found out, in some quiet, ordinary way, that you had been wrong from the very first day? Leave it down below, because someone else reading tonight needs to know they were not the only one at the window. And if you want another story about the quiet ones, the ones the world wrote off too soon and was wrong about all along, there's another one waiting for you right here.